Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here in this roundtable on publishing. I'm Ayanna Thompson, a Regents Professor at Arizona State University, and I suppose in this capacity, the publisher of ACMRS books. I'm happy to host this panel, and I want to thank Patricia Akimi and everyone at the organizing committee at Rutgers for putting together a great symposium this year. I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves by saying who they are, what they edit, and what kind of work they're interested in. And so I'll just call them in order. Let's start with Karen Raith.
Hi there. I apologize in advance for any tech issues on my side. But thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone on the call. I'm Karen Raith. I commission across early modern literature and history books at Oxford University Press. It's a very broad range, it's a very diverse list, but we publish across a range of product types, editions, textbooks, biographies, and some trade titles for a general readership. But I would say that our bread and butter is the academic monograph. So we do very much welcome proposals from anybody attending the conference, and we're open to discussions at any time.
Welcome, Karen. Next, we have Nick Jones.
Great, hello. Good morning, afternoon, evening for some, perhaps to everyone. Nick Jones. I'm currently at UC Davis, and also doing a scholarly residency at NYU with the King Juan Carlos Center. And with that, I'm also a book series editor with Routledge, where I co-edit with my great colleague Derek Higginbotham, who's at the University of Hawaii. And so for our book series, we commission and are interested in proposals that really, on the one hand, are rethink the early modern period in really productive and provocative ways with respect to cultural studies, critical theory. And so with that, we've received proposals, and we have some really fascinating and cool topics coming out, ranging from art history to close readings of particular literary texts. So with Critical Junctures book series with Routledge, we're really interested in, again, ideally, monographs, but also edited collections, again, that do the work of really rich, close reading, working with materials, objects, throughout the early modern period writ large, and not specifically tailored, and also working across language. So we're also really interested in works that not only focus on the Anglophone, the English-speaking world, but also Iberia, South Asia, early colonial Latin America as well. So it's a really we encourage materials that come from folks working at really new cutting edge intersections in the field.
That sounds great, Nick. Thanks and welcome. And next, Christina Lee. Oh, and you're muted, Christina.
Of course. Thank you so much. I'm Christina Lee. I'm an associate professor of Spanish and Portuguese at Princeton University. I'm also the co-editor of the book series Connected Histories in the Early Modern World, published by Amsterdam University Press. This is a series that I co-edit with Julia Schleck at the University of Nebraska. And our series contributes to the growing understanding of the connectedness of the world during a period in history when an unprecedented number of people, Africans, Asians, Americans, and Europeans, made transoceanic or long distance journeys. This is a series that's been inspired by Sanjay Subrahmanyam's innovative approach to early modern historical scholarship. We seek manuscripts that explore topics that highlight the cultural impact of the movement of people, animals, and objects at a global scale. We welcome proposals for monographs and collections of essays in English from literary critics, art historians, and cultural historians that address the changes and cross-fertilizations of cultural practices of specific societies. Topics could concern, for example, cultural confluences, objects in motion, appropriations of material cultures, transcultural identities, religious practices, translations and mistranslations, cultural impacts of trade, discourses of dislocation, globalism in literary and the visual arts, and cultural histories of lesser studied regions such as the Philippines, Macau, and African societies.
Thanks, Christina. Welcome. And last but not least, Jenny Tan.
Hi, I'm Jenny Tan, Associate Editor for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at Penn Press. We're very interested in acquiring monographs in medieval and early modern across all disciplines. And I'm particularly interested in work that can build on the press's traditional strengths, but also continue to push the boundaries of what medieval and early modern studies is and can be, whether that's expanding beyond a sort of more traditional focus on Western Europe. I'm particularly interested in comparative work, as well as work that embraces new approaches and methodologies and puts the fields of medieval and early modern studies into conversation with really vibrant scholarly discourses going on in other fields, as well as work that can then kind of turn that lens back on the discipline and kind of think about, well, what do we mean when we say medieval? What is early modern studies? So work that can sort of put its object of study into relation with, thinking, the kind of thinking that I think RaceB4Race is doing about, what does it mean when we call ourselves medievalists and early modernists, and what is the field doing and what should we be doing?
Great, welcome, Jenny. So Jenny, I'll start with you just to go in reverse order. I thought the first question is one that I think a lot of early career scholars want to ask but don't. But what does a perfect proposal look like to you? What elements are in it that make it look like, oh yes, I really want to see this manuscript? Can you start us off there, Jenny?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll say first of all that I think nowadays, with the kind of hyper professionalization of, I think, the early career stages, there's so much pressure to have a perfect proposal, and there's really no such thing as a perfect proposal. I think the perfect proposal is the one that helps you put your best foot forward and, really shows what your project is all about. And at least from my perspective, if the proposal, if it's missing something that I feel like, well, is a conventional part of every proposal, I do understand, that not everyone necessarily knows these kind of opaque norms of scholarly publishing. So I don't, I think for me, a proposal is less like, oh, well, like you didn't check these 10 boxes. And instead of, sending you an email to ask, like, what are your comparable titles? Like, I can't deal with this imperfect proposal. It's not like that. But I will say that I think a really successful proposal shows that your book, I think a really successful proposal is one that kind of shows not only the topic and approach of the book and what kind of text you might analyze or what your object of study is, but that really conveys your particular argument, your point of view, and then what the stakes of that argument are. I think that's what some people would refer to as the so what question. But I think that's maybe the part of the proposal that I most often find myself missing when I read submissions, is this sense of what is the greater importance of this argument? I think that's where you're forced to think about the way that argument converges with audience, and that's sort of related to the question of, you know, who will want to read this book and why. I think especially first books, they tend to have a very concentrated focus on making a particular argument or a contribution or filling a gap in the literature. But I think it's equally important to have that connection to a readership, not just in the broad sense of, oh, like people across these 10 different fields and subfields could potentially be interested in the work, but also making the case of why.
Great. I was going to go to you, Karen, next. Do you have elements that you think are in the proposal that really screams out to you, I want to read this manuscript?
Well, I really liked what Jenny was saying about conveying the argument. I think a good proposal, I would say, is one that actually matches what you're writing about. And you get readers say, that was a great proposal, but the manuscript wasn't about that, so it didn't give, you know, kind of jarred. And how would you like to revise that manuscript to make it like that? So I would say, don't get too bogged down in getting the perfect proposal. Show how it's an original contribution to the field. Extra brownie points if you can say how it will complement the list, but commissioning editors will have a clear sense of that as well. And don't be afraid to come in and speak to editors before you send in a proper detailed proposal. If you send in your proposal and say, I think it's ready now, this is a revised dissertation, but I don't have any sample material for you, you know, it doesn't give us anywhere to go on. But if you do want to have informal conversations first, just to see areas where your proposal can be developed, then that's really helpful for us as well to kind of guide you through the process, because we don't expect you to be an expert proposal writer straight off the bat. And as you develop in the field, maybe you'll get even a little bit lazier writing proposals. So it helps to kind of put more effort into it at this stage, because publishers really appreciate that. Another thing I would say is, you know, concentrate on word length, word count even. If you're going to send me a proposal for a 155,000 word monograph, then you're going to have to make a really big case for that, and why it needs to be that length. So think about those things, and the contribution that is making to the field and what you're trying to say. Don't over specialize it. You know, if something gets too specialized, we might worry about the market for that and whether libraries are going to be able to invest their very tight budgets in your work.
Great.
You know, if you think it would complement a series like our Oxford Literary Geographies monograph series in early modern literature, just, you know, point that out and think where it would find a good home on the list as well.
Great. Nick, I'm going to pose a different question to you now, because I think what I've seen in a lot of proposals, especially for first proposals, is a confusion about audience. Because, and I think Jenny touched on this briefly, but there's often the sense that if it's a book that's been revised from a dissertation, it has a very narrow audience, but often proposals act as if high school teachers around the country are going to read this arcane bit of scholarship. So I wonder if you could address how you think authors can think more clearly about audience.
No, absolutely. No, that's, yeah, a great question, thinking about audience. And I mean, for me, at least, the way that I would kind of, you know, attack that kind of ominous monster of, you know, audience is really, and as it relates to, you know, drafting and drafting this proposal and pitching your work in it, is, in one sense, for me, it kind of circles back and speaks to what Jenny and Karen have said about that voice. And so for me, audience, or the way in which a proposal then later on how that translates and manifests in a book is that authorial voice, that command, a certain type of, for me at least, an authorial gravitas with which the author writes, engages, guides the reader, not only in that proposal, but in that transition and evolution into this product that's published in digital, you know, it's in a digital form and bound and so on and so forth. And so, and not to be all, you know, capitalist about it, but I think to be, you know, honest and frank, there are, I think, speaking to audience a lot of times, especially when we think about the ways in which, again, both presses and editors and authors themselves, again, pitch and promote and sell themselves, if you will, on social media as one example, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, those are forms of audience or audiences. And yeah, my, you know, one takeaway from that, again, is, you know, is thinking about your, and even if it's an edited collection, the cohesiveness of one's, again, authorial voice, stakes, again, going back to what Jenny had said, you know, the stakes and the greater impact, because again, for me, at least in the reversal of that, that's a form of audience. You know, who are you speaking to? What do you know, what are you hoping to get out of it? Not just for you in a kind of selfish way, if you will, but also your community, you know, your community of scholars. And there definitely been, you know, proposals in a sense, but also, you know, books as well, where you can definitely see with regard to audience that this author is definitely speaking to a specific audience, whether it could, and that audience could be a generation of scholars, that audience could be a different set of communities and bodies of people, constituencies, so on and so forth. Also marketing, again, I would say in the proposal, at least when, you know, when speaking from firsthand experience, writing my own proposals, but then also reading and learning from other folks' proposals, you know, materials that come in, the marketing, for me, the marketing section is interesting to read, because going back to audience, you can learn, you get just other insights and you know, kernels and nuggets of information, different, you know, textures and silhouettes, if you will, of what the project could be, or, you know, might be, so on and so forth. So that's, yeah, that in short, that's what I would say. And then also I would definitely, the last thing, and I will be quiet, I always recommend folks to have senior scholars read their proposals. Again, for that, not just in an editing, in a copy editing sense, but again, to diversify the vocabulary, to find whatever like blind spots or unseen weird things that might come up in the text. Because again, a book proposal for me, at least, is a genre in its own right. And it's I've always learned a lot from having senior scholars, you know, whom I admire, read, just, you know, have an extra pair of eyes, experienced eyes over your proposals.
Thank you. Christina, since I'll ask the same question about audience, since you're publishing and like looking at global contexts, how do you think through audience with your writers, or think about it for the proposals that come into you? And you're muted still.
Thank you. I always, you know, I get asked this question a lot. I'm currently the director of graduate studies, and my students, you know, some students will say, I want to write something that can be published. I want to write my book. I want my book to be my dissertation. And I say, well, there's a big difference between a dissertation and a book. And the book the dissertation is written under the advice of a specific advisor, and you're going to have a committee. And everyone is going to have a say in a specific thing, and you're going to have to engage in some subjects because you're being guided by specific scholars. So in some ways, the readership is smaller. For the book, it's very important that the author defines, this is what Nick has been emphasizing, and Karen as well, and it's the audience. I mean, you really need to be able to envision that audience. And in a series like mine, it's difficult because it is about a global history to some extent, but you're still engaging with you're still part of a specific field. So in my case, my focus has been the Spanish Pacific. And even more specifically, I've been working on the Philippines under Spanish rule. So I know who I need to engage at the level of the Spanish Pacific. But at the same time, I am, aware that my work is going to be read by a different public. And I envision, and so then you have to think, okay, what is the topic? Well, I myself study religious practices. So then I know that people who will be interested in my book might come from religious practices, but might not have a lot of knowledge about the Philippines, or they might not even know that the Spanish ruled the Philippines for such a long time. And then, but the Philippines was technically part of New Spain, was a province of Mexico. So I also envision that part of my audience will come from Latin American studies. So I think that when you are able to kind of visualize who's reading your book at the very micro level, macro level, you can produce, you can frame the book in a much more clear, more clearly. And so I would, so that is a really good question, because some people might think, oh, it's global, so therefore I have to mention everything. No, you don't mention everything. You are still dealing with a specific topic, but you can do that in a way in which you're engaging everyone. And oftentimes my advice to someone who's, for example, studying, I don't know, travel by indigenous people from Mexico to the Philippines and vice versa, or let's say that's a topic, I just made that up actually, I don't know anyone who's working on this. I would say, make sure that you that you make people who are in your circle, who are dealing with the same topic, let them know that you understand the bibliography and you're dialoguing with them. And at the same time, think about how you would explain this to your best friend from graduate school who's working on something else. And I think that's a good way of getting rid of the jargon, because I think the jargon is a big problem. That is what a lot of times impedes people from continuing to read a book. They read like the first 2 pages and they don't understand half the words on those pages. And so I think clarity is very important.
Great, that's such good advice. I always try and imagine writing to my mother, who's educated but not an academic, and so how could I explain these complex topics to her? She's let me know that I've hardly succeeded. There's only been 1 or 2 books that she thought were readable. Jenny, I want to ask...
1 or 2, I'm sorry, 1 or 2 books is very good, so congratulations.
So Jenny, I wanted to ask, and this is touching on a point that Nick raised sort of quickly in passing, but what are some of the realities of publishing that you want new authors to understand, whether that's timing or like the realities of how fast a book can come out, or money, the kind of, the capitalist industry that we're in. Or what are one of, if you could think of like one or two things that you want every new author to know about the realities of publishing, what would they be?
Yeah, those actually, Ayanna, that's a great question. And I think those two things you raise are probably the two things. One is timing, and two is, yeah, the financial reality of publishing. And I'll say for timing, especially if you are the author of a first book, especially if there are any sort of important timelines attached to your book. Tenure is the most obvious one, but also some authors are looking for a book contract that'll help them on the market. The process takes much longer than I think almost everyone assumes. I think I've never spoken to a first-time author who wasn't surprised by the answer when they asked me, well, how long until I get a hardcover book? And I would say, if from the time that you submit your book proposal to the time that your book comes out in print, if that happens in 2 years, I'm already very happy about that. I normally say, for my own kind of estimating and planning purposes, I normally plan about 3 to 4 months for the peer reviews, an additional month for preparing a response, going to the faculty editorial board, and then depending on the nature of revisions called for, anywhere from 3 to 9 months or even more for revisions before production can begin. And I think authors sometimes tend to think like, oh, I did my revisions, I got you my final manuscript, like the book is going to come out really soon. But nowadays I would say it's probably about a year from the time that your manuscript goes into production to the time that it comes out into the world as a book. So I would say just plan ahead, just assume that the process will take longer than you might think that it should. And especially if you have any kind of hard deadlines, the earlier that a publisher can know about that. It's never too early in the process to say, this is my tenure book, I'm going up for tenure at this time, what's possible here. And I will say about the financial reality of publishing, I think that's probably not a new topic to many of us here. And these questions of what is the audience for your book, they also pertain to publishing's reality, which is that we have to be able to count on being able to sell the book to readers, being able to see the book taken up in course adoptions, having libraries interested in acquiring the book. I think I will say that this is kind of a mindset that I had before I started working in publishing, which is that I always felt like, oh, it's too bad that we have to impose all these financial realities and market realities on scholarship. And while that definitely is true to an extent and true in many situations, I think that what I've realized and what I always try to convey to authors is that those two things are not necessarily diametrically opposed. Like what marketing thinks will make your book appeal to more readers and what will result in an intellectually stronger and more impactful book, those two things often go hand in hand, right? It's not just about, pandering to an audience so that they'll shell out money to buy copies of your book. Like often, the kinds of suggestions that and I experienced this myself, when I was a grad student, was feeling like, oh, I love my very specific topic. I love my very specialized, reading of whatever particular text that I think everyone should care about. And I do still think that everyone should care about them. But if the more that you can kind of make the case for why your book is important to a greater number of people, that's a marketing concern. But often the feedback that comes from the marketing team is also, even though marketing is their sort of priority, it often is something that does result in a book that will be, I think, more meaningful to more people.
So well said, Jenny. Thank you. Karen, I wonder if you want to jump in, and what are some of the things that you wish that new authors, or even senior authors like me, what do you wish that we know going in? Like, what are the things you want us to know realistically about publishing with OUP?
Well, I liked what Jenny said, not just to copy what you're saying, but about, I think, before I might have said it takes 2 to 3 months for a manuscript to get reviewed, but that was prior to the pandemic. And if you're wanting a more diverse readership, you have to be sensitive to people's personal schedules, that they might be juggling childcare as well as trying to do their job and, read your manuscript for, a very small honorarium. So it's just good to be upfront about timelines and that sort of thing. Part of the press's objectives are to, disseminate the best research. So there are some things that we invest into that might not get as much revenue as something else, so we are willing to invest into complex critical editions, ensuring that they're available online. But we do need to think about the bottom line by and large. And so I would say, if you're thinking about publishing a book and you're wanting to publish some articles from it, the press wouldn't really be publish lots and lots of articles from that book and it's available elsewhere, because as I said before, the library market is suffering at the moment. That's nothing new, but that's just getting worse and worse as the pandemic hits. And they're wanting to invest more in journals and digital availability of things. So if your articles are repositories and you're trying to revise them into chapters in a book, then that can be quite problematic for the press. So it's just trying to think about those things up front, and whether or not your research is best suited as one form or another is quite useful. Going back to timelines, as well as having the peer review process at the press, we do have delegates who, while we have publishing committees, it's their say on whether to offer a contract at the end of it. So we do have an extra hurdle to get over. We do think it makes it more rigorous, ensures really strong quality of scholarship, particularly before it goes out into the academic world. And so it sets you in good stead before external reviews are being submitted on your research. But it is an extra kind of step in the process that you need to bear in mind for timings.
That's really helpful. And I will also say that to be upfront in that initial contact, as Jenny and Karen just said, it's important for the author to say, when I come up for whatever review it is that they think is important, whatever milestone, like, is it that you need a contract? Is it that you need the book in print? Is it that you need galleys? So the more information you can tell the press about what you need and when is important. All right, so we've got a couple of questions come in. The first is from Patricia Kimi. Hello, Patricia. When I was approaching editors as a first-time author, I was so worried about what to write in that first email inquiry. What do you welcome and what do you find off-putting in a first contact from a potential author? How about Nick? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh boy, let's see. I'm just rereading the question one. So off-putting. Oh boy, thankfully I haven't been in that situation, but I guess I know one thing. In brevity helps, I would say. So I would advise, folks out there who might query an editor via email electronically. Brevity goes a long way. Obviously, you be respectful to pleasantries and respectful, professional and such. But yeah, write, ask what you need or want to ask, kind of get to the point and then sign off. And so I would say brevity goes a long way. Yeah.
I agree. I would also say for me, but I'll ask Christina and Jenny as well. This is the moment, if you're doing that first query, to lay the stakes in a pithy version, right? So like if you're remembering about like, you know, job talks and or elevator conversations. You've got your 5-minute version, your 3-minute version, your 30-second version. Like this is the email one is the 30-second version. Christina, do you agree or disagree of other advice?
Yeah, I agree. I've never received an off-putting email. I think, you know, I welcome any emails, and sometimes the topic won't fit our series, but if it's very promising, I'll send it to our to my editor, Erica Gaffney at AUP, and sometimes she finds a home for an excellent book. So, you know, I always say the worst thing that could happen is someone doesn't answer back or they say no, and then you move on. But you got to try it. I mean, it was very difficult for me to publish my first book. And, you know, I got so many rejections, but the book got published, and I don't really think about the emails that went unanswered, or, you know, that were responded, you know, in the emails that at the time kind of hurt me. But, you know, you just have to try it. You have to go for it.
Great. Our next question, I think, goes back to something Karen was mentioning. Says, for a first or second book, is there a threshold for how much for a book? I mean, how many chapters have previously been published as articles? I remember the old rule of thumb was 2 chapters or less than 20%. Is that still the case? Or Karen, do you have a different rule now?
I mean, sometimes, you know, if you are a more established scholar, we have published collections of essays, right? But I would say by and large for a first or second book, I probably wouldn't want more than 2 chapters to have been published elsewhere.
Jenny, do you have
wiggle room?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Jenny, do you have the same at Penn?
I would agree with that. And also add, you know, if you can make a case that the sort of article version of the chapter has been majorly reworked, and explain why the book version will either supplant the article version or will be consulted for a different reason, that they're not interchangeable, that to me is where the wiggle room comes in. If you have multiple chapters and all of them sort of reuse a little bit of your article work, but in such a way that is particular to the book project, and where, you know, no one would think that, you know, you can just cite this one article or even 5 articles instead of consulting the book. I think that in some ways, to me, that's preferable to, you know, your book has 4 chapters, and 2 of the chapters are basically journal articles, but you've rewritten the first and last paragraph to fit it into your book. So it's the quantity, but also the way in which you repurpose that material. The more reframing, and the more that you embed it in the through line of the book, the better, and then the more likely it is that you might have a little bit of latitude in the amount of reused material.
Great. I'll just encourage the audience to put in, like, here's your chance to ask all your real questions. So put them in. But I have one that I've heard from many early career scholars who worry that, you know, they're doing interdisciplinary work, but they worry that it doesn't look or fit within the list that you've already created. So I was wondering if you could speak to how you think about interdisciplinary work, whether it's like, you know, it's not new anymore now, but like whether it's bringing critical race theory into pre-modern studies or whatever. Like, it can look at first as if it doesn't necessarily fit within your list. So I was wondering your approach for that. Jenny, do you want to start us off there?
Yeah. I love interdisciplinary work. I'm always really excited about it. I think that, yes, as Ayanna mentioned, there are 2 struggles with interdisciplinary work, and I think one is sort of a more external one, which is finding a publishing home for interdisciplinary work when, you know, perhaps one of the press or publisher that you're interested in, specializes very strongly in one particular discipline, but maybe, isn't such a natural fit for other disciplines or fields that you're in conversation with. I think it's useful to, I mean, you can ask editors, what they think about your work, what they think about interdisciplinary work. You can, I think it's useful to see other books that the press publishes. Does the press publish interdisciplinary work like yours? I think it's also helpful to see, most presses have a website that lists their acquiring editors and the fields that they acquire in. And I think you can learn a lot by seeing how these fields are subdivided. Like if you go to Duke University Press's website and you look up their acquisitions editors, each of those editors has an enormous list of fields. And it's not because, each of them, covers like 20 fields comprehensively, but it's because they're very invested in interdisciplinary work, and that list of different fields indicates what intersections they're interested in. Whereas a press that has, a history editor and a sociology editor and a literature editor might have a different approach to disciplinarity. I think the other struggle that interdisciplinary books can have is the question of audience again, and really making the case that you are putting different disciplines or different discourses or different theories into conversation with each other in a way that really speaks to conversations already going on in these disciplines. I think it's easy for an interdisciplinary book to kind of lose its sense of audience, especially if you're trying to put together two disciplines or two audiences where people might come to the book with very different assumptions or very different bases of knowledge. And it's not just about, explaining the obscure jargon of your field or, writing a plot summary of a text that everyone in your field knows, but maybe people outside the field don't know. But it's really making sure that you're engaging questions and problems that are important to the fields and disciplines that you want to participate in. And I sometimes explain it as, a Venn diagram with 3 circles. And I think sometimes scholars imagine that their audience is the entire Venn diagram, but the book is kind of framed in a way where the audience is actually like the intersection in the middle of the 3 circles. And sometimes that's fine. There is a value to work like that, but I think it's important to be aware of and to make sure that you really are speaking to the whole Venn diagram, which can be really difficult.
Academia has a large percentage of narcissists, so we all think that we're speaking to all Venn diagrams across time. All right, we've got a bunch of really great questions. So one, which is kind of a nuts and bolts question, is how much of the book do you want to see along with the proposal? Do you want to see a full manuscript, a few chapters? What's your preferred amount? And I think similarly, how much of the full manuscript would you ideally prefer to be finished before a first-time author sends in a book proposal? It's encouraging to hear that it's not too early to have an informal chat with an editor, but I was also wondering if it's possible to be too early with sending a proposal. So I wonder, Karen, do you want to start us off on that one? How much do you want to see with the proposal?
It depends. I would say on an initial conversation, if it's the first book, I'd want to see at least 2 chapters just to get a flavor of the book. And then it might be, especially if it's interdisciplinary and you're touching on something a little bit later in the book and I can't get a sense of that in the chapters I'm looking at, then the readers won't be able to either. So it might be that I want to see the full manuscript, but I could send a letter of interest at any point if I have invited a full manuscript, if that's helpful. It just helps preempt any negative feedback they might get from readers who sometimes look at 2 chapters as not a fully evolved idea, that's not always the case. I'm sure that it is fully formed, but that's just sometimes invites negative criticism or saying, you really thought about that. And you will be given opportunities to write a response to reports, but just because of our delegates process as well, and needing to have enthusiastic reports from readers, it is useful to just put your best foot forward, and that's why we might say, I actually need a little bit of a bigger sample. So it varies for different projects, but certainly do be in touch earlier. I would say don't come to me with your thesis that's not revised in any way and doesn't have a roadmap for revising it, because that'll put in your head and an editor's head that it's very specialized, particularly when they're reading the literary review just at the start. So definitely think about how something needs to be transformed into a book, but come along when.
Great. Christina, how much do you ask of your authors to submit with a proposal?
Generally, we require form, which is really, it's a book proposal. Sometimes some editors will want the narrative proposal. We have it in the form of it's a form, but all the elements of the narrative proposal are there. That form is very important. Has to, I would fill out the form with a lot of care. I would pay a lot of attention to the section on the abstract, the table of contents, intervention, which scholars you're engaging with, and then generally it's a chapter, the strongest chapter of the book, sometimes we might want to see more if it's a first-time author with no publications, but generally that is good enough. Is the form and a sample chapter.
Great. And Nick, how much are you guys asking to see?
Great. I mean, at early stages, just the book proposal, which then goes out for peer review. And so that's, it's kind of zooming back a bit and looking holistically. I would like to, just let people know that every press works differently. Every press has its own protocols. You have, like in my experience with my staging out of the Negros book, that I remember I submitted the proposal, and that proposal went under quadruple peer review. That proposal went out to 4 readers. And then on the back end of things, and this kind of circles back and speaks to the interdisciplinary question, you'll have certain editors and presses or book series editors who may, be invested in a project, will love a project, but know the politics in the larger field. And then just to have that extra security, if you will, through that peer review process, a proposal will go out for peer review, then those reader reports go back, and then an editor may, and then from there, the press, the editor, or editors with whom you're working will decide, okay, send us this amount of chapters, or write the manuscript and send us the manuscript when it's ready. So I would say kind of do your homework a bit. That's where also developing a relationship with an editor or a press helps, because there's so many internal protocols and politics, and not politics in a bad way, but certain presses just operate differently. Even with that, when a book proposal has gone through peer review, there'll be presses that'll issue you an advance contract. You have some presses who'll look at the proposal, and then they won't issue in a contract until they see the entire manuscript. The manuscript has gone through peer review. So I would say, every press, works differently, has different expectations. And so just be prepared for, whichever, I would say.
Yeah, and that can be part of your initial inquiry to the press, to say, here's the stake of my argument, right? Like the 30-second version, and say, what would you need to see along with a proposal to or what would you what would you like to see at this time, so that you can ask that question. Okay, we've got a bunch of interesting other nuts and boltsy questions. One is about embargoed dissertations and non-embargoed dissertations. Jenny, does it matter for you guys about this strange new world that we find ourselves in?
So I think this is a question where different editors have varying opinions, but I will say that from my point of view, and I know a lot of colleagues who feel the same way, it doesn't really matter to me if your dissertation is embargoed, because ideally the book will be you will have developed this project into a book that is so significantly different from the dissertation that I wouldn't see them as two competing things. I wouldn't see them as like, oh, I can access the dissertation for free, so I'm not going to read or buy the book. I think for most dissertations, I would like to see a level of kind of revision and development that would make it, not really important for, if the sales of the book depend on the dissertation being embargoed, that's, probably not an ideal situation. I do think it's nice when the book has a different title from the dissertation, simply because of discoverability and searchability reasons. So if you have a really, really great title that your heart is set on, I would say maybe don't use it on their dissertation, save it for the book. But I know, I have also seen some great books that just have the same title as the dissertation. So I'm sure that's not a deal breaker, but just a little thing to think about.
I love it. I love it. Okay, we do have another question about subventions. How does the potential need for book subventions for color image plates, for example, impact your interest in publishing a book? Is that a factor in your decision making? Karen, do you want to start us off there?
By and large, we need subventions to print in color. We can publish. We can print in black and white, but then have color images in the electronic and online editions. So you wouldn't need to worry about it from that sense. But it wouldn't be an obstacle to us from peer reviewing it and the manuscript, just so long as you are flexible as well with knowing that we may have to print in black and white. But there will be electronic images, colored images available in the e-versions. Great.
Jenny, is the same true for you or different?
Yeah, I would say actually exactly what Karen said. It's not something that will impact our interest in the book or our willingness to send it out for review. It's not something that sort of impacts that kind of editorial decision making, but it does depend on you being flexible. Color images, requiring a subvention, that's pretty standard across university presses because of the high cost. And I would say also, because of what kind of complication that adds to pre-production, production, printing. So, it's not just like, oh, how hard is it to include like 6 color images in the book? It really makes the entire process much more involved. So the more, I would say it's not something where like, oh, like if you don't have a subvention source lined up, like don't even get in touch with me. But it is something, that I think subvention for color images is very different in my mind from, subvention just to support the publication of a book, which is a bit different.
Great. Okay, I think we only have 2 minutes, so I'm gonna, this is a question. When thinking about that so what payoff, how big does the scale need to be? This will change the world, change English literature, change the field, subfield, our understanding of the author. So how big of the payoff of the so what are you looking for? Nick?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I'll tackle this in 2 ways. Directly with, again, the book series that I co-edit with Derek. I mean, we want those kind of bold, ambitious, courageous stakes, takeaways, so on and so forth. So I would say for us, we encourage that, welcome that, look for, projects that, do that. And again, during the peer review process and even our own internal editorial process as editors, we can, again, make suggestions, recommendations, guide the author or authors if it's an edited collection. Tone it down here, frame it this way, kind of massage this less or more, so on and so forth. Speaking from experience, again, there's stakes and risks involved with that. I mean, I'm always of the idea, and it gets tricky because in a first book, you'll have folks who will discourage you from, writing a first book that's, really bold in the sense of, the question that was asked. And
tackling the elders.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Right. I mean, and for me, I was like, the hell with that, go big or go home. Honestly, that's just my style, how I encourage, not just, colleagues, but especially, younger scholars who were, in this, crazy process of, writing their first books, go big or go home. And I encourage you all to find a press that welcomes that, because again, every press has its own culture, its own personality, if you will. And there were many presses who I had on a dream list, and they all said no. They all said no. Going back to Christina's, there are, many who just said no. But, there was, one editor, one press, who took a risk on the project. And again, having worked with that editor and meeting her at a conference and talking about the project, so on and so forth, which is, why this, roundtable is so great. Thank you all for organizing this. That's where those relationships and bonds develop and are nurtured. And, at the end of the day, for those projects that are interdisciplinary, that are, have these really strong, bold, as Ayanna said, kind of, attacking the elders, if you will, type of, stuff in it, I'd say, be true to yourself, stick with that. But, once the book is out in the world, as a dear colleague of mine said, we'll see how it behaves out in the world, and yeah.
Thank you. I cannot thank the panelists enough. You are such busy and talented people, and it's really an honor to speak with you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you to everyone in the audience. Sorry this wasn't a smaller coffee talk where we could see you all, but please do reach out to any of us individually or collectively if you want to talk about your projects or you have more specific questions. We are here for you. We want to support your work. Thank you, Patricia, everyone at Rutgers for organizing this, and we'll see you later today. Thanks.